Hi everybody, it's Courtney. Today I'm going to be using the Holiday Cheer stamp set by MFT, and this is going to be the only image that I actually stamp. So I'm going to go ahead and stamp her out with Blackout ink by Ink on 3 onto a piece of Nina Solar White 80-pound cardstock. This is cut down to 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. I'm just going to stamp her right there in the middle towards the bottom, and I'm going to kind of build my scene around her. So what I had in my head is completely different than what this card actually came out to be, which is usually the case. So I'm going to start off by kind of drawing out my little scene with my pencil and my T-square ruler first. What I want this to appear like, as if she is standing on a sidewalk in front of a bunch of different stores, like she's Christmas shopping. So as you've probably heard me say, my scenes usually involve a ruler and straight lines because I don't have any artistic ability. And based on the way this card came out, I'm not happy with it. So you guys will believe me when I tell you I have no artistic ability. So like I said, just kind of drawing out my scene here with my T-square ruler with a pencil. That way I can kind of just erase any lines that I may not line up correctly, or something that I may not be happy with, before I go over it with my Copics Safe pen. For the middle building, I added a little bit more detail to that one, just because that's right in back of her. So as far as the windows go, I added a little bit of a frame around it. And for this one over to the right, I'm going to add, what do they call that? Like a canopy type thing over that main window. So once I was done with my pencil, I'll move on to an EK Success journaling pen. And these are different sizes, so as far as the tips go. So this is the 0.25, which is not the thinnest, but I think it's like the second one, just because I want my lines to be not overly thick. But basically all I'm doing here is going over the same lines that I had already drawn out with my pencil. If there was any lines that I wasn't overly happy with, now I could go ahead and correct them. And once I had this done, you'll want to make sure that you erase any pencil lines that might be showing, because once you color over it, you will not be able to get those up. So once I had all of this done for this little, I'm going to call it a canopy. I'm not sure exactly what it's called, but over this window on the building to the right, I'm going to add a little scalloped line or scallops underneath it, and then just diagonal lines, and they'll get straighter as they get towards the middle of the canopy, if that makes any sense at all. I added some words to some of the signs for like a toy store and a cafe, and now I'm just adding lines to this little sidewalk. Like I said, I'll go ahead and erase my pencil lines, and we'll move on to the Copic coloring. I'm going to have this sped up quite a bit here because the coloring took me quite a while, even though it's not really difficult coloring. So I'm going to start off with the sidewalk, and I'm just starting off with my C1 and kind of mapping out where my darkest areas will be. Then I'll go in with the darkest color, and I'm not putting this in all of the dark areas. I'm going to put it where the sidewalk meets the buildings, and then just a little bit of a shadow underneath her feet and underneath her little gift bags. Moving on to the C5, I'm going to flick that C7 out a little bit and extend those shadow lines. I'm also going to add just a strip of this color to the left-hand side of these little lines within the sidewalk. Moving on to the C3, I'm going to flick that C5 out even further, extend those shadows, and also thicken up that line that we had created within the sidewalk, the lines within the sidewalk. Finally, I'll go in with my C1 and pretty much just blend this out. I'm going to cover up the entire thing. You want to make sure that your marker is nice and filled up or juicy in order to fill a large area like this, so you don't get those streaky lines. You may have to go over the same area more than once to kind of even some of that out with any alcohol marker, no matter what markers you use. So we'll move on to the buildings, and I wanted to keep these all pretty neutral tones. So I'll start off with this little, what's supposed to be a toy store off to the left. Going to start off with my lightest color here and just mapping out my darkest areas, which will be on the bottom part of the building where it meets the sidewalk. Also going to create a small little shadow underneath the sign itself as well as underneath the window. Going in with the darkest color, going over those same areas that we mapped out. Blend that out with my two midtones and then going back to my lightest color. Next, we'll move on to this middle building here, and I'm going to be basically coloring this the same way with just a different color combination, but again, keeping this pretty neutral. Starting off with my lightest color, and I'm just going to go around her. I'm not creating a shadow where she's kind of, the image itself is in front of the building because she's not directly in front of the building, so she wouldn't be casting a shadow on it. This is kind of further in the background. Just gonna have to be careful while I go around her because some of the areas of her little outfit are going to be white, so I want to make sure that I don't go over those areas with the darkest color of this building, creating those shadows to the left hand side and underneath these windows, and I extend that out each and every time with my darkest color, then the two midtones, and then the lightest color will be on the top of the building anyway. For this third building, again, keeping this neutral, moving on to the E30 markers, darkest area being on the bottom, lightest area being on the top with a shadow underneath the little sign and the windows. For the roofs of the buildings, I'm going to color these all the same. And I'm going to be using some warm gray markers. I'm going to go right in with the darkest color. And I started flicking just to kind of get my blend easier, make my blending easier. But then I ended up drawing a straight line where my roof starts, just because sometimes when you start your flicks, you end up not with a straight line where the flicks begin. So this will kind of guide you as to where those flicks should start. Then I blended that out with the W5, which was kind of drying up, and I do not have a refill for this one. So I kind of depended on my W3 to help blend those colors together. I didn't want to press too hard on that nib and ruin it. I'll just have to put that refill on, on my wish list, I guess. Next, I'll move on to the window frame on this middle building here, and I'm going to be using some E70 markers. Again, keeping these neutral tones, filling in the entire area with that lightest color, and my darkest areas will be on the top part, I don't know what you call that, but the top part that comes off the frame itself, and on the bottom portion of the frame, blending that out with the mid-tone and then back to the lightest color. I only did a 3-color blend here. Those are the only E70 markers I have, which is why I did the 3-color blend. So for the sign on the toy store and the cafe, as well as that little canopy there, I'm going to bring in some B90 markers. Going to start off with the lightest color, mapping out the darkest areas. The darkest areas on the signs will be off to the left-hand side. And for the canopy there, I'm just putting a straight line on the left side of each of those little lines. Going in with the darkest color and going over those same areas that we mapped out, blending each of those out with the two midtones, including those little lines. All I'm doing is making those a little bit thicker each time, and then finally going in with the lightest color and filling in the entire area on that little canopy to blend all of those shades together. Now for the windows, this is not a night scene, so I didn't want to color them yellow as if lights were on inside. So I started off with a BG10. Well, first I fixed up any areas that I had kind of went out of the lines a little bit with my colorless blender. Then I'll go in with the BG10. And once I got this down, it was a little bit too, I don't want to say bright, but pastel-y, if that's not a word, but a little bit too pastel for me. So I ended up going right over it with the BG70, which is a little bit more dull, but it's still a very light color. It didn't really make too much of a difference, but it toned it down a little bit so it wasn't so bright. For the sky, I'm going to be using some more B markers here, and the lightest color will be the B12. So I'm just going to kind of go over the areas that will eventually be the darkest, which will be right on top of the buildings, and then it will get lighter as it goes up. B16 will be my darkest color, blending that out with the B14, and then finally back to that B12, filling in that entire area. Again, you may need to go over these areas more than once, especially being it is a large area and you're kind of filling it in solid with one color. To avoid those streaky lines that you get with alcohol markers, you may need to go over it more than once, which will darken up the color. So just keep that in mind when you're picking out your colors, that it will actually be darker than just, going over it one time. So once all of my background was done here, we'll move on to coloring this little girl. So I'm going to start off with her skin tones, starting off with my lightest color, mapping out my darkest areas, which will be underneath her little hat and off to the left side of her face. Going in with the darkest color, then the two mid-tones, then back to the lightest. I did add a little bit of R20 to her cheeks. And for her little outfit, I wanted to... Oh, first I forgot about her legs. So I did my shading off to the left-hand side and underneath her jacket, and just did one little flick where her little kneecaps would be, just to kind of add some texture there. For her outfit, for her jacket and her little socks, I'm going to go to my go-to red combination as well as her hat. So starting off with my R22 and mapping out those darkest areas. For her hat, it will be on the bottom part. For her jacket, it will be off to the left-hand side, underneath her collar, underneath or on the side of where she's holding that present on the left-hand side, and where her jacket comes together in the front, off to the left-hand side. For her socks, it will be on either side because this is a round object. It's going around her ankles, and I just extended one little flick right there in the center to give those texture as well, to make it look like they're kind of like slouched down a little bit. Going over those same areas with the darkest color, and then blending that out with the R46, making those lines just a little bit thicker. For her little socks, this is where I'll start adding some color to either side. I skipped that part for the darkest color. You don't necessarily need to add your darkest color to every dark area. You can certainly do some shading with your darkest midtone. So onto the lightest midtone here, extending all of those areas out even further, and finally going back in with that R22 and blending all of that together. Now, I did have some bleeding here with the red, but we'll fix that up a little bit later. That happens a lot with reds for some reason. So for the white areas on her hat and her, I guess the cuffs of her sleeves there, I'm going to use the C markers as well as her little shoes here. Started off with the black on her shoes, then the C7, then the C5. I used the black just because I didn't want these to blend in too much with the sidewalk itself. They did a little bit, but I'll add a little bit of a highlight with a white gel pen later. Just did a little bit of shading with the C3 and a C1 on her collar and on her hat and the cuffs of her sleeve. These are supposed to be white objects, but they still would have some shading, and on the bottom part of her jacket as well. For her mittens there, I'm going to be coloring these a darker green, and I'm going to be using two different green combinations for her mittens as well as some of the gifts that she's holding. For the mittens, I'm going to, as always, start off with my lightest color, but the shading would be towards the bottom where her sleeves are kind of over her mittens a little bit, and the lightest part would be on the top. Also coloring that one little gift bag off to the right with the same color combination as her mittens. And for one of the gift boxes as well as one of the other bags, we're going to switch over to a different green combination. And again, starting off with my lightest color, which is actually a YG marker. The other three are G markers. So I'm going to go in with the darkest color, then the two midtones, and then back to that YG. When you're switching back from YG markers to G markers, I find that it's easiest when you get back to that lightest color to not only blend out the lightest mid-tone, but to go over the entire object, because you're switching over to a YG, so it's going to have more of a brightness to it. So in order to brighten up the entire object, I color over the entire thing, including where I did my shading. For this other little gift bag, as well as this other present, I'm going to switch over to some Y and YR markers here to make this look kind of like a golden yellow, but coloring it the same way as far as putting down my shadows with my lightest color, then going in with the darkest, then the two midtones, then back to that lightest color. Also filled in that little ribbon on top of that green present with just one of the Y markers. It doesn't really matter which one you use. It's pretty tiny area. So once all of my coloring was complete, I did use my white gel pen just to add a few details. I fixed up some of these areas that my red kind of bled out. I put some polka dots and some stripes on some of the gift bags as well as the little presents. Added a reflection on top of her hat as well as the toe of her shoes. And once that gel pen is dry, we'll add some shimmer to some of these things too. So next I'm going to stamp my sentiment, and I messed up here. My stamp must have touched the card panel before I actually stamped it down, and I have some lines underneath some of those letters. The VersaFine takes a little bit of time to dry, so I let that go for now, and I figured I'll fix that up once that's dry. So what I decided to do, first I added little crisscrosses to the rest of these windows because I just wasn't liking the way these buildings were looking. I'm still not happy with it, but you guys know me, I'm never happy. So what I tried first was to take a white gel pen and add a highlight around each one of these letters. It didn't work. I don't know whether it was the gel pen or the way I was doing it. I don't know. But I've seen other people do this before and it looks amazing. I do it not so much. So I went back to my go-to thing, I guess. I seem to do this on pretty much every card. Took out some scrap black cardstock, treated that with my anti-static tool, stamped that sentiment with Versamark ink, sprinkled on some Hero Arts white embossing powder, and heat set that. Cut this into a strip not much bigger than the sentiment itself. Then pop this up with some foam tape. Then when I realized I popped it up with foam tape, it was not centered on my card panel. So I ended up having to trim a little bit off my card panel from the side and from the bottom, and then adhered this to an A2 size card base. And finally done with this card. Thank you guys so much for stopping by. Have a great day. Bye.